What are you up to these days, Chris? I saw an update on your LinkedIn.
Oh, I formed an LLC. I'm subcontracting through Columbus Consulting, and I started a project with Nintendo this week. It's actually really neat. Nintendo will be a little new for me, but I'm looking forward to it. It's going to be a lot of fun.
Nice. So, Chris, how did you get your start in supply chain and in planning?
So, in a really interesting, humble way, I was a store manager in Atlanta, Georgia during the Olympics for Famous Footwear. I had the pleasure of having my corporate team come visit to make sure that we were assorted well, the stores looked good leading into the Olympic peak. I was talking to my allocation team who had a store in a fairly upscale suburb of Atlanta, so we had some unique merchandise needs, especially on the women's side of the business. I'd worked really closely with the team to optimize assortment. I was 24 years old, didn't have a degree, and running a retail store, they were like, gosh, an awful lot about what drives your business from a merchandise standpoint. That was in June or July before the Olympics had started. In September, they asked me to join the allocation team. I moved from Atlanta to Wisconsin and spent a couple winters in Wisconsin being an allocator and found out I really liked it. And that's what got me to where I am today.
Yeah.
And fast forward, Chris, you've worked at a number of brands that folks would know they've got in their home right now. Hanes, Paula's Choice. How have you seen that, taking from that experience you just shared up
Sure.
into the most recent, the changes in technology? What are you seeing? What's at the forefront right now?
My most recent experience has been with Oracle's supply and demand planning cloud. I'm seeing a lot more in terms of artificial intelligence and machine learning being able to generate that and seed that demand forecast. It's been interesting to see the evolution of that machine learning technology and the artificial intelligence kickoff of the demand forecasting cycle, both in a very newness focused environment like Justice and Champion were relative to a replenishment side like Hanes and Paula's Choice were.
And you've implemented in lots of different contexts, lots of different software to get at this problem. One of the things that I spend a lot of time thinking about is this dynamic between once you know what you need, but it's custom to your business, you can launch into a process to take a solution as an enterprise grade solution and customize it to your use case, but you're signing up for a very big bill and a 12-month process to get it in place. On the other hand, the business is evolving quickly and you got to use process plus spreadsheets to just keep up and run the business. It's interesting. Machine learning has really benefited demand forecasting over the last 5 to 10 years to get the demand forecast better. But the supply modeling is still kind of this, we're configuring SaaS, and that just takes time.
My most recent experience is really matching variability in the demand by channel, not just in the units, but in shelf life required. In Asia, culturally, anything that's under 18 months of remaining shelf life is seen as old or aged product and not desirable to the customer. Selling from a B2B standpoint, our B2B customers are going to have certain amounts of shelf life that they were expecting to be delivered. So it was not just I need to sell 5,000 units in September. It's I need to sell 5,000 units of those. I need 18 months of shelf life. I need 15 months worth of shelf life for this retailer. For Marketplace, I'm going to need 7 months worth of shelf life. So it was really kind of breaking down the supply both on hand. I mean, what was coming in on order, obviously that was, we knew what the shelf life would be based on the manufacturing date, but really being able to dissect our current on hand. And we may have had a lot of inventory, but it wouldn't be palatable to all the channels. That's where supply really had its challenges, taking the demand forecast and be able to project that out, is you really had to get under the covers to understand what the freshness factor of that inventory was and whether it was going to be inventory that was going to be sellable to all the channels. Did they match correctly to the channel's demand requirements?
Right. And then you get into making sure that information about the freshness of the inventory is available to the planning system to dynamically match the right inventory to the right channel. So you're not getting a bunch of returns from your partners for stuff they're unwilling to take. Yeah, and that's the problem we're thinking about all the time because the requirements are so unique for all these different companies. You're either like have to have this massive repository of modules and rule sets and configurability that you can get off the shelf, or can you use AI to model that very quickly and then give folks a solution? But there's this sort of buying process that I think folks are used to where it's like, show me a demo. And it's like, okay, let's go through the 45 modules that we have in our platform and we're going to do a 2-day demo to like show you every single module and then let's talk about what you want out of it. I've never been in those meetings. I'm curious.
They're long days. I'm not going to lie to you. And earlier on in my career, as we were looking for allocation solutions 1 and 2 at Vera Bradley, it was difficult to see things in the theoretical, not our data, not necessarily our business model, not our sales curves. Seeing it in that hypothetical sense made it tough. As I came along in my career, I was able to put that together a little bit more cleanly. But I'd say year 10 to 12, when I was working on these solutions at Vera Bradley, I didn't necessarily have that vision, especially with competing solutions. We went through 3 of those demonstrations that you just referenced. It was tough to visualize how the solutions would be able to service in the end without really seeing data that at least mimicked what it is that we did if it was not our data itself.
Yeah, you're kind of always in this holding your breath and then jumping in and working super hard to get it to work for you.
What were those key features when you talk about shelf life and the technology? What were the things that you found were super critical, that were excellent, and what things were you finding lacking? What did you need that you didn't have?
In my most recent experience, we architected our NetSuite instance not to have lot level detail. When we set up the stock keeping, it was at SKU and not necessarily at SKU lot. So we were missing that visibility in the ERP down to that level. Where that was visible to us was in the warehouse management systems, as opposed to the ERP driving the master data to our planning systems. We were actually drawing WMS extracts, which came in 3 different flavors from 3 different warehouses, right? And then having to cleanse that data, merge it into a single data stream to inform the supply side module of the intersection between the lot and the shelf life. But that's not something that we had natively in the ERP from when we actually stood it up. That became a challenge for us. As far as some of the other modules that we were looking at, I think one is really being able to look at a forward forecast. Lots of models are great at looking backwards, and just really integrating a forward demand forecast and being able to deploy forward against that relative to deploying just a history that's already actualized. In a replenishment business, Hanes socks is an example. You may be able to do that with your predictable curves that you're going to have at holiday and back to school. But in a business where we were introducing new products that had new solutions to different customers, everything was different. And we had to rely on sales input to the demand forecast. We could model it against prior new product introductions, but ultimately we weren't serving the same customer with each product we were innovating. Some of them were going to be more broader based solutions. Some of them were going to be solutions that would not necessarily appeal to all customers. Something that's an acne solution, if I don't have that problem, then it's not a problem for me to solve. So it was interesting as we went to model our innovation sales, because we had really heavily rely on sales for your forecast from a sales team, which are always going to be optimistic, right? And they should be. We believe in the product. And sometimes they took off a little faster. Sometimes the marketing would click a little bit harder. Sometimes they took off and didn't do as well. That's the case, not just in my most recent experience, but in apparel too. When I was with the bra brand in 2012, we had a floor set that performed terribly in Canada. And we figured out it was because it was during the 10 weeks that you can actually wear t-shirts in Canada, and there was outside seaming on the bra. You always have to look at the product relative to who you're selling it to and when you're selling it to make sure that it's fitting the right time. Outside seaming on a bra in September when you're wearing a sweater, nobody's going to know. But you do that in May, June, that's not going to work out so well. Each new product introduction is unique. And those are the things that in my worlds have been toughest to forecast. You don't know how something is going to do at the outset. There's a lot of work done that's way outside of my area of expertise to determine what an appetite for new product innovation was going to be. I will tell you at Vera Bradley, we did small pattern tests. This was in the early days of Facebook. And so people would say, hey, if you want a sneak peek to, spring, 2012's patterns, I go into the store in San Antonio and they've got those set and they're testing them. Unfortunately, that would give us false test reads because people would go in and clean out the test assortment and put it up on eBay because it wasn't going to be available to the general public until much later. It was very interesting how we were able to get some predictive demand, but ultimately we're testing in July for a pattern that's going to be released in January. So, even then it becomes a little bit more difficult.
You just reminded me of the kid working at Famous Footwear back in Atlanta, Georgia, who knew exactly what needed to be on the shelf, net market, right? And that's all you're trying to do.
I really fell into fashion as a career by accident, Jeremy. Chico's was a very fashion forward brand. Justice relied on newness. Vera Bradley relied on newness. When I was at Hanes, the brand may not have relied on newness as much, but Champion was one of the brands in the portfolio at the time before Hanes had sold it off. I worked for Hanes during the pandemic. I started in October of 19. If you think of historical demand modeling relative to what was actually true in 2020. I'll give you a great example. Traditionally, we sold 1.4 tops to every bottom. Ties to what I've seen in other companies, and it made sense. Then COVID happened. What we found is that as it became clear that it wasn't going to be just 2 weeks that folks were going to be working from home, we saw a run on sweatpants. And to the point where we were relatively out of stock on all women's sweatpants for a period of about 4 months. If you were less than a men's medium, you probably weren't finding anything on champion.com in that time. We went from that 1.4 tops to every bottom to 4 bottoms to every top. It was a very interesting time to pivot what we needed from a supply standpoint, and then also thumb in the wind of how long is remote work going to be a thing. The pre-2019 demand curves in apparel will be very different than 2020 and forward. Being able to sense that shift in demand quicker and be able to make your supply match that demand as it shifts and be able to read those trends earlier, and you're not as much of a victim of lead time and sales actualize.
Michael, maybe that's our next podcast series. There's so many stories around the impact of the pandemic on supply chain and planning and what it's done to the
Yeah.
industry.
Pandemic, now it's tariffs. So there's
Yeah.
always a disruption that comes. It feels like the cycles of disruption, whether technology disruption or geopolitical, accelerate. And the nimbleness of teams to respond is so important. And just like you're describing, Chris.
We even saw the pandemic effect at Paula's Choice because makeup was no longer a requirement. There were folks that had skin breakouts from masks, right? Skincare actually took a very large uptick during the pandemic, and it drove a lot of brand awareness for us, which was great. It also coincided with the time that TikTok became a favorite social media venue as we were all sitting in our homes in 2020 and watching TikToks. Skincare actually got a good foothold on TikTok, and Paula's Choice as a brand got some benefit out of that.
Chris, as we wrap up, I'm curious, like what big lesson learned for you or advice that you would have? Maybe it's somebody at the beginning of their career in supply chain and planning. Like what are the things to get right? What are the skills to focus on? What advice would you give someone who's just starting out?
Start in the weeds and look up. Really go down to that lowest level. I'd say the two biggest learnings that I've had from that, one was that store class week level modeling that we were able to do for Justice. And the second is the SKU lot variant, really getting down to the lowest level of what composes your inventory. In footwear and apparel, that can also be at a size level too. That was especially important at Justice, where we had the girl for 5 years. The center of where our size curve was would tell us if customer acquisition was bringing in enough new customers. If we saw everything start to shift to the right, then we knew we weren't necessarily bringing in new customers. So I'd say start at that lowest level of detail and work your way up. You don't have to be perfect, and you don't have to have every data point, but pay attention to the big ones that are outliers and consider what impact that's going to have as it rolls up the supply chain.
It's so interesting. Of course, that's music to my ears as the founder of a company called Atomic because we run all of our models at the unit level. It's funny, I was talking with a brand recently and they're very tops down driven in terms of their modeling. And then they look at rolling 13 mix and break that down. They have relatively stable demand, but their smaller channels kind of like come out in the wash because they're not big movers. And so they can kind of get away with it, but they have this new channel that's coming up. It just became their second biggest channel, but it's still lumped in with everything else. And they couldn't start planning it because it was all in spreadsheets and they'd have to rebuild all their spreadsheets to handle it differently. And they're like, oh, we know it's wrong, but we can't contemplate rebuilding all the infrastructure that we've built because we look at it in aggregates. It's funny, you can get away with it for a while because the things that are small can seem marginal. But
Right.
then when something in the underlying piece starts to become a big driver, it breaks the model. But I really love the idea that you can track when you have that 5-year band, that you can see if you're growing your customer base or not based on the velocity of different sizes moves. It's like incredibly specific to a certain type of business, but is super cool to be able to find.
There was a lot of really interesting sizing work that we did based on attributes that we saw too. So we could do the exact same screen print on a pink ground versus a black ground, and it would sell differently from a size curve standpoint. We were supported by a size optimization tool that allowed us to assign which attributes were going to drive the size curve. Reflecting back to my first days in footwear, we had to really pay attention to size curves by store. But I'll use Hawaii as an example because one of my good buddies was the merchant for Hawaii. Most of their traffic came from Japan. Anything above a men's size 10 was pretty much a non-starter in Hawaii, and they didn't really have a way to outlet it. They would have X number of containers that could come back to the States on a yearly basis. We were really aggressive on the left end sizes that we would send out there, and on the right end sizes, they would get stick runs. I'll tell you, the way to find what's not working, and this may seem really elementary, but you can look at it a level below, is to go look at what's on the clearance rack. If you were to go shopping for shoes in Hawaii, you're probably going to find most of the clearance is going to be size 10 and above. And it's those things that you can find at that micro location level aren't necessarily working. It could also call out something that, as the district managers were traveling between stores and spotting, they're like, every store I'm in, the clearance racks are empty from size 8 to size 12. And it's all stuck on left end and right end sizes. And then that really called out some differential that we needed to do on the size analysis side in order to make sure that we sort back to school correctly for the year following. It's
Funny how the patterns show up. Yeah. It
yeah,
makes me think of at Tesla, we would have inventory at the end of quarter that was left over. And I just remember because it's such a stark example in Florida, they thought that red cars would sell really well. We had allowed regions to specify their inventory cars. And then they'd complain in the last few weeks of the quarter that all we have are red cars. Like, what's going on? And it's like, yeah, you've overstocked on red and that's all you have left. And that's kind of the, and then we made it more statistically driven. All of a sudden, didn't have that problem anymore.
At
it's really
least now I know what to get a good deal on when I'm in Hawaii, as everything else is super expensive, Chris. Just pretend we stopped recording now, and because this is kind of a stupid question. When people ask what I do or what our software does, I talk about planning. I feel like they have no idea what planning means. Like if we say planning, what do they think? Like wedding planner? I don't know. What do you
Mhm.
tell people that you do?
Get things to the right store at the right time at the right price. That's a very 2008-9 way of saying it. Maybe in the right channel at the right time at the right price.
I was just having this conversation with a friend who was at this company. They do payroll software, but he was saying, "Oh, well, we were like HR and like all these different things. We didn't want to just be payroll."
Right.
And ultimately, they were like, "No, we're payroll, but we're better, or we're like next generation payroll or something." And it's this thing of you gotta just embrace the thing and go with that. Which for Atomic, right? It's like, are you demand planning? Are you MRP? Are you a simulation engine on top of ERP? What does that mean? We're picking our spot. I don't think I have an answer quite yet. I think we really are MRP, but it's not as understood what that means, I think, in
Right.
e-commerce context, like material re requirements planning.
Right.
Like make sure you have the stuff in the right place at the right time. And we do forecasting too, but demand planning. If you say demand planning, everyone's like, what are your price elasticity models? They're
Right.
good, but we're
Yeah.
really good with this other stuff. Anyway.
There's a lot of good unique pieces to Atomic that I think you can hang your hat on. You have to figure out which ones to lead with, right? So,
Yeah.
I just got a question from a client today, like
Yeah, I saw.
right before this podcast. And I was like, oh, geez, is this going to take me 45 minutes to figure out? I'm going to be late for the podcast. I threw it into the chat, got the answer like within with like
But
two
that is
minutes.
a crappy chat.
Yeah. And it was clear as day. I made sure it was clear as day, pasted it there. And I'm like, there you go.
that's awesome.
showed the client how to use it so they could do it themselves next time. All right, Chris, thank you so much. It's a pleasure
All right.
meeting you. I'll send you those clips when we're ready to go.
Sounds good. Thanks, guys.
Thank
Bye.
you. Bye-bye.
Yeah.